Good evening and welcome back to Lawrence Explains Online Academic Tuition. So in this video I'm going to look at Priestley's moral lesson and how his espousing of the philosophy of socialism and state communism actually worked out for people, for those that actually lived under it in a number of countries in the 20th century and in a few countries still in the 21st century. So this is a follow-on from the previous video, which I looked at a series of quotations and seriously challenged the coherence and the applicability and the validity of the ideas. So Priestley's moral lesson. There is an inherent incoherence in much of the vision of the world Priestley has. Again, this does not mean he's a bad writer. He's a very good writer. He's a very good dramatist. But his vision of the world is skewed and highly inaccurate. And when this vision is applied to society, the effects are an economic and human catastrophe. The likes of which, only the Second World War really even compares to what the effects of communism are on a population. And even probably really communism's even worse than the Second World War, because at least the Second World War has an end point. There's only so long it can go on for. Eventually there has to be a winner. With state communism, it is unending in some cases. So we're going to take a look at the first of all the country of the USSR, Russia, and the Soviet states, which was Priestley's kind of totem really. The play was obviously performed first of all in Moscow in 1945. Priestley was a big supporter of communism. I don't know what his position was as he got older, as the true horrors of state communism were revealed. I would imagine any even half honest intellectual, as the 20th century wore on, basically kind of withdrew their support and eventually changed their political views, changed their views when they saw empirically what happened when these systems are put into place. There's a number of journalists who grew up in went through the kind of radical times of the 60s and so on, and were quite sort of Marxist-y types, the likes of Roger Scruton, Christopher and Peter Hitchens, and who just really ended up going in the other direction, much more kind of a free market direction or a conservative direction, in the case of Roger Scruton, because they could see what the effects of this political philosophy were. So we're going to look at Russia first of all. So I'm going to begin with, it's a bit of a strange place to begin, I think, where it seems like a strange place to begin, but this is under Stalin, basically some of the economic the economic disaster of having a centrally planned economy. So when you have a communist system, it's no longer the evil landowners and the evil merchants and the evil salespeople and the evil shop owners, goodness me, and the evil farmers who are in control of their little segments of the market. Under state communism, you have a centrally planned economy. Everything comes from the great big brain in the middle, Stalin and his many geniuses. And as you can see through the data of productivity, we have a decline in basically harvest from 1930 to 1933. Their productivity goes down by about, well over 100%. So the productivity goes from 5 million tons down to 1.7 million tons within 3 years. This is how inefficient governments are when it comes to a centrally planned economy. There are good reasons for this. I'm not going to go into them here, but there are a number of technical reasons for this, and they're pretty obvious to anyone who with even a cursory bit of study of microeconomics. And we see the same with wheat as well. We have 1930, 31, they're both kind of not too bad, and then very, very rapidly we have this rapid drop off. And this was just simply a question of, there was a poor harvest, but this is really, it's much more, that doesn't explain like a 100% drop off. But yeah, what you see is the management under this crisis. So we've got a bit of an issue with the grain. There's something of a poor harvest, but due to the inefficiency of central control, that is compounded to the point you have a massive shortage in crops. And now we go to the Ukraine. During this period, we have people beginning to starve because the crops are not there and the food is not there. Interestingly, Stalin still exported grain, so he was still exporting the grain for a profit externally, external to the USSR, but he wasn't actually feeding people within the USSR, particularly the poor Ukrainians. And this, I think, is a really good. This is a really good example. I'm not going to read everything out, but it's a really good example of what I'm talking about by this kind of evil central control. It was illegal basically to even try to get out of the Ukraine. So if you were a starving peasant, even trying to escape was illegal. You'd be put in a gulag, or in basically a prison. So your choices were starve to death, which people did, millions of them starved to death, or be put into a gulag. You weren't even allowed to make some attempt to get to a better life so you could survive or your family could survive. Pretty grim measures. The purges, the gulags, the camps, within their own system, they would call them class hostile elements. My goodness me, I'm not even going to go down that route. But things got so bad, and this is what I want to emphasize in this video. Under state communism, things got so bad, people were so desperate, so controlled, that people resorted to cannibalism within the Ukraine. Same with Kazakhstan as well. Ranging from eating leftover corpses to murdering each other to feed themselves. More than 2,500 people convicted of cannibalism during the famine. Can you even imagine how desperate you would have to be to eat? We're getting to the point of eating corpses. The good people died first. Those who refused to steal or prostitute themselves died. Those who gave food to others died. Those who refused to eat corpses died. Those who refused to kill their fellow men died. Okay, so that was a doctor who wrote that. So this is when I say, people talk about markets in a cynical way. Markets are an amazing thing for getting us the supplies that we need to survive. And when you take away those markets, you distort them, and you have supposed intellectuals, in my view, arrogant idiots, trying to run an entire economy centrally. This is what happens, and the end result is people starving to death and cannibalizing themselves. And what makes it even worse is under Soviet communism, they weren't even allowed to try and make an escape, because this is bad news. This shows that the regime is failing, and we couldn't ever show that we were failing. So when you look at the paranoia of the US about the spread of communism, because it's a seductive idea on the surface. It's a very seductive idea on the surface. Priestley was not a stupid man. He's seduced by this. But when it's put into practice, the actual the number of things that are not taken into account by the people who are looking at it from the outside to begin with are just absolutely vast, and the number of problems that arise that are, absolutely deadly, as we see here. So this is serious stuff. As you can, it doesn't really need me to go any further than that. Historians estimate, this is all available on Wikipedia. There's a number of other books I recommend as well. I'd recommend looking at the Gulag Archipelago for Russia. There's a ton of books on Russia, so I will warn you though, they're very difficult to read. Very difficult to read. Some historians have estimated that the numbers killed by Stalin's regime was 20 million or higher. This is supposedly the regime that was going to create a totally equal society, create a utopia in which you would all be your brother's keeper. And yet we have 20 million people dying in the Soviet Union as a result of this regime. 800,000 executions alone, and those are just the recorded executions. 1.7 million deaths in the Gulag. The Gulag is just this kind of basically a labor camp, prison labor camp. 1.7 million deaths in the Gulag. My goodness me. You basically enslave and murder the vast portions of your population in order to create this nonsensical utopia. The deaths of the 5.5 to 6.5 million people in the Soviet famine are sometimes, not always, included with the victims of the Stalin era. So the reason I put the famine to begin with is because the famine occurred before Priestley wrote the book, before Priestley wrote the play. So I question, whether did Priestley know about this famine and the way that it was dealt with by Stalin? If so, I'm going to give him the benefit of the doubt, because if he did, then the work is essentially a work of propaganda, and it's an evil work. But I'm going to give him the benefit of the doubt and say that he didn't know about it. And the likelihood is, in fact, he didn't know about it, because most of the outgoing statistics, as you can imagine, were totally suppressed. It's harder to suppress things now. These communist governments still do suppress things, but it's a little bit harder. It's easier to just see how ridiculous things are. It's not as easy for them just to completely suppress information. So yeah, this is Russia under communist regime. Yeah, judicial executions and so on. So this is what it's about. This is what communism is all about. The great equalizing, beautiful ideology. And just to go back to Russia, Russia has never recovered from the communist era. To this day, it hasn't recovered. The reason being that the only surviving institution within communist Russia was the mafia. The mafia are a little bit like cockroaches. They will survive under any circumstances, under any institution. And in fact, they actually thrived to some extent under the communist government, because they were able to get themselves into activities that previously would have been taken up by legitimate business owners. So when you can sell illegal grain for massively inflated prices in the Ukraine or parts of Russia, because people are starving to death, you don't even need to be involved in highly dangerous activity, because that was already criminal enough as it was. That was sanctionable probably by death or the Gulag. So the mafia was able to expand its reach. So you have this bizarre situation in which every other institution is annexed, and the only one that survives and to some extent, at least continues, if not maybe thrives, is the mafia, because they're doing illegal stuff anyway. So it makes no difference, what government is in. And post Soviet collapse, the mafia really took over many institutions within the country. So you have this weird alliance of Putin, Russian intelligence, big military, massive mafia control in a way that's quite difficult for someone in the West to even understand. and then oligarchs, controlling resources, the oil and so on. So you've got this real ungodly alliance in Russia. I know Russians are very patriotic and so on, and obviously there's loads of amazing Russian people. But in terms of the governance of the country, they really are still reeling from state communism. Now they have adopted a more free market approach to their general economy, which has raised the standard of living for many Russians, although for a lot it's still pretty low standard of living. Anyway, so let's move on now to China. I don't know as much about China. Frankly, I don't know a huge amount about Russia. I just know, reading a few books and also speaking to people as well, including some people who actually lived through the back end of the regime. But China, we have, an existing communist party. China is still governed by the CCP, the Chinese Communist Party. And obviously we had, in the 50s, we had Chairman Mao Zedong, Zedong, I think it's pronounced, who led the quote-unquote great leap forward. They do think of the most... is one thing about these communists, is they think of the sickest names for their programs, their failed programs. So again, you see the consequences of... I'll let you read it here. I'm not going to go into it, but the consequences of having a centrally planned, centrally controlled economy when it comes to, just the food supply. What happens? The market is distorted. Supply chain is completely distorted. Farmers are basically coerced into working for the grand vision and are not able to just kind of look after themselves and provide a service to the market as they would usually do. And what happens is you have, an agrarian disaster. You have a famine, and you have, you basically have starvation. The Great Leap. Millions of people died during the Great Leap, with estimates ranging from 15 to 55 million. So vastly more people died in this famine than the one in Russia. The effects are predictable, and this is the thing with communism and with socialism as well, is these effects are predictable. That's what's even worse, really. And especially now, anyone espousing this kind of stuff now, I'm sorry, it's immoral, because we know what the effects are. The standard of living, obviously, in Russia and China was completely stagnant and even substantially regressed. They have these grand, projects. Many of them fail, though. Many of them fail. In short, Dwight Perkins says the Great Leap was a very expensive disaster. So no increase in production and massive cost of life. And again, China has not recovered from this at all. I mean, it's still run by the Communist Party. All they decided to do was essentially to do a pivot and, just like Russia did, adopt free market policies within the economy, so at least they can increase the standard of living. So it basically downloaded the Western sensible free market economy, let people trade, let people who know about their own trade in it and do it, rather than having everything controlled by people in government who know absolutely nothing about the trade or the business or the product or the service. Just common sense, basically. So free markets have taken the standard of living in China to a much higher level than it was. However, in terms of civil liberties, levels of freedom of speech and so on, they're just non-existent, basically. I work with quite a few Chinese students. It's very clear they've been educated in a pretty intense way. So have some quite interesting ideas that they put forward. Tend to be very knowledgeable, but quite critical thinking is not something that is emphasized. So that's a bit of a change for them coming into the UK university system. That's China. the two major countries, Russia and China, that have enacted state communism, which was advocated by Priestley in all of his nonsensical thesis in the play, it has proved to be a murderous disaster. And you look at other countries that have adopted more free market approaches, more based on civil liberties and so on, the likes of the UK, Western Europe, Australia, even South America is a little bit mad because you've got all sorts of different regimes cropping up all over the place. But to an extent, South America, and you can see those countries that have leaned further into those things have done much better, much higher standards of living, much higher standards of civil liberties and freedom. So we do have empirical evidence. This is not guesswork. This is not a battle of the ideas. We just have to look at the evidence. This is about empiricism. Okay, so this is kind of my thesis on it. It's pretty, just kind of crank this out pretty rapidly. I just kind of dash this out pretty rapidly. The answers put forward by the inspector, and by extension Priestley in the play, collectivism, caused an economic decline that resulted in tens of millions of people dying in starvation across China and Russia. So that's the economic effect. People die of starvation, countries stagnate, productivity declines. And productivity is not just about making money, it's about your standard of life, standard of living. That's what productivity is really about. The money is just a way to keep tally of things. Collectivism inevitably leads to the centralization of power. So rather than power being dispersed across a nation with different factions, different individuals, different businesses, politicians, different interest groups, you have a complete centralization of power in which bureaucrats decide the fate of millions, paying no consequences themselves when their ill-conceived policies inevitably fail. From an economic cause and effect standpoint, the deadly inefficiencies of collectivism have been well understood since before World War II. So since basically the famine in the Ukraine, this was studied by economists at the time. I think it had been studied before this as well. These effects are well understood, and but this was unfortunately not heeded in China or later on. From a human right and liberty point of view, communist Russia of its time and modern-day China, North Korea, Cuba, and Venezuela have some of the lowest levels of civil liberty imaginable. Suffering, humiliations, indignities are almost impossible to do justice to. So this is where Cuba comes in. I've actually been to Cuba, spent a month in Cuba about 15 years ago. I really wanted to go before the end of Castro's life, and it was before Castro died, just to see what it was like. I was 20 at the time, so I wouldn't say I was a sort of radical communist, and I wouldn't say I was a sort of free market person or anything like that at that point. I was very open. What is this? I was just going at things as an open mind. My attitude at 20 was, it's very unlikely that I have all of the answers. And that's what I would say to all students. If anyone has got this far, you don't have all the answers if you're 16, 17, 18. You don't even know what the questions are, and you haven't accumulated anywhere near enough information to kind of make your mind up. So for people to be having strong political opinions in their late teens, to me is a delusion, to be honest with you. Keep reading, keep an open mind, and keep trying to figure things out. But I went over to Cuba with this kind of mindset, and you just see the grinding squalor there, the absolute squalor, the endless propaganda, these massive billboards everywhere, pro-Castro billboards, sort of hypnosis. It's bizarre as well because you're in the Caribbean, and it's like, it's so odd, it's so bizarre. Not to put too fine a point on it, but the level of products that you're able to get access there is so low because the supply chain is so distorted and disrupted and overseen by the government. Poverty is absolutely, miserable. People literally will leave the country, like literally floating in a tire trying to get to Miami. This happened thousands of times. Many people have died trying to do that. So other people have succeeded and actually managed to get to the United States. Prostitution is absolutely rife in Cuba. Actually, male prostitution is also rife as well. It's not just female. It's quite shocking, actually. And presumably that has to be an effect of poverty. People just can't make enough money. Just anything they are able to do to try and get a bit more money is pretty desperate. So yeah, Cuba it's a tragic country, to be honest. And the Cuban people are wonderful. The Cuban culture is a wonderful culture. The music, the art, my goodness me, it's spectacular. But that's all there despite the regime. The regime didn't put any of that stuff there. The regime, that all existed before the regime. And if the regime ever falls, it doesn't seem to be shown many times that it will, that stuff will continue and it will flourish even further. So Cuba is a country that is just lagging further and further behind all other countries in the region. The statistics that come out of Cuba, I can tell you most certainly are not reliable, having been there. Some of the stuff that I've seen, like Cuba, has a GDP per capita of $10,000 per. That is absolute nonsense. Absolute nonsense. I'd say maximum 3,000. It's one of the poorest countries I've ever seen. It is squalidly poor, and it was the richest country in the Caribbean. It was known as the Pearl of the Caribbean. And you look at other surrounding countries now, Colombia, Panama, Dominican Republic, Jamaica, they've all overtaken Cuba many, many decades ago. It is languishing because of communism. So yeah, that's the take on Cuba. The industrialist represented by Berling may have been a selfish buffoon. Berling, I wouldn't defend him as an overall character. He is a selfish, slightly, buffoonish idiot. But he was forced by the economy to produce a product at a reasonable price in order to enrich himself. This in turn creates employment and career progression for those working within the company. And it also creates products that were desired by the populace, raising their standard of living. Life in industrial Britain may have been tough. It was certainly far from utopia, but it was better than life had been in the days of feudal agriculture, and it was better than life in almost any other country on earth at the time. So when we look at the injustice and so on, and some of the working conditions, we can't compare it to modern day Europe. We've got to compare it to what had gone before, and actually it was an improvement. People wouldn't have gone into those jobs if they weren't an improvement on prior situations. So the goal is not to get to utopia. That's been proven to be a disastrous, murderous, and a desperate, fruitless task. The goal is to improve. The goal is much more humble. Can we just improve on where we've been? And the Industrial Revolution definitely achieved that for the UK and for the rest of the world as well, ultimately. So yeah, the underlying thesis of Priestley in the play, the effects of that thesis, it's difficult for me to even emphasize enough, how damning they were and how damaging they were. I think the part where you start to read about Ukrainian cannibalism under communism, 2,500 people being arrested for cannibalism. By the way, they actually had to put out posters telling people not to eat their children. This is how dark that got, and this is how dark things get under communism when people are starving to death. So yeah, it's a completely immoral and evil results from this ideology. So I think this is something that is not shown to students enough, and it should be, because it's reality. Now, obviously we focus on World War II and Hitler and so on, but we don't focus on the death and destruction and darkness that was caused by these communist utopias. or dystopias as they became. So yeah, I'll leave things there for today. It's pretty intense video there. I'm going to come back and do a couple more on an Inspector Calls. This is obviously a slightly different series on an Inspector Calls. We'll probably get back to the more academic-y stuff in future videos. This is academic, but it's really taking Priestley to task in a way, as opposed to just analysing the play.